People are feeling disengaged, disenchanted with politics. They don't trust politicians. Reform isn't a protest vote to that. The issue is not climate. The issue is that people feel that they want action, and there's a cost of living crisis that is not going away, and people feel like they voted for a new government that was going to represent real change, and that change hasn't come.
Hey, welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am founding editor Richard Delavan, also head of mission control here at wickedproblems.earth. Recording on the morning of 3rd of May, on Saturday. It's been quite a week in UK politics as well as other places around the world. And here in the UK, we knew local elections were likely to lead to more reform support, Reform Party UK, led by Nigel Farage. And you heard there at the top from Holly Brazier-Tope, Director of Politics at the Green Alliance, and climate journalist Dave Vetter, both of whom will be joining me in the first interview, which will be recorded while voting was still underway. But she was already kind of giving her analysis about where some of the debates we would imagine are going to fall as a result of the election results. It's not the climate, she said, it's the feeling that government and politics just aren't working. So the question was never whether reform was going to make big gains. The question was what response the Labour government, which campaigned in part on making the UK electricity system, the power system, basically carbon-free by 2030, more or less, plus continuing on with other forms of climate action that not only have that, but the co-benefits of energy security and cleaner air and all that good stuff. Whether or not they would, in fact, buckle under presumed pressure from people who are objecting to the things required to make that happen, like pylons or electric vehicle mandates or heat pumps or solar farms, etc. Because the Reform Party in particular has majored on demagoguing them. And so as the results came in, yesterday morning I spoke with Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, returning guest on the show. And the results at that point were kind of clear, but still incomplete. And then as yesterday rolled on, it became pretty clear where we were looking at the extreme end of the probability distribution curve in terms of outcomes. I live here in rural Kent. Love the area, love many of the people, but you do hear pub talk of on the order of before the election last summer, that the reform vote was going to rise up and overwhelm the existing major parties. And the problem is that, that sounded like, kind of swivel-eyed loon stuff for somebody like, maybe that's enough. You've had enough to drink, mate. Maybe lay off on the next one or have water or something. Problem is that seems to be going the same direction as Brexit, which also would have been the sort of thing I would have overheard 9 years ago. And people just me just kind of shaking my head and rolling my eyes and like, yeah, I'm not going to argue with you about that. Which maybe was a mistake, because 9 years of chaos later, things are not great in UK politics and economics. I don't know if you noticed. And it just seems to be a disease that keeps bouncing back and forth across the Atlantic, which is great. Because yesterday, in addition to having a out-and-out climate denier be elected as the mayor of Lincolnshire, one of the most climate at-risk places on Earth in the north of England, we also had Darren Grimes, a anti-net zero populist right-wing influencer, I guess. He appeared on radio this morning on the Today program on BBC, and my wife and I were yelling at the radio, like, what is happening? Why is this clown on the radio? And the reason is because he was just elected as a councillor in Durham for reform. And that's why. So when, by some statistical analysis, it became clear that the vote from yesterday, or from this week, I should say, that if it had been replicated in a general election scenario, then we would be talking about Prime Minister Nigel Farage today, which did not seem like something even 3 days ago that I was going to have to think about in my lifetime. But here we are. Now, this is just a local election. It does not mean that's what's going to happen. There are 4.25 years to run on this current Labour government, but it does beg a really more urgent question immediately, which is, what do you do if you are Prime Minister Keir Starmer, even though you're sitting on a huge majority? The question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to try to pivot and try to placate the right wing? And if you've got people who are in your ear giving you advice, but the way to do that is by just cutting all this green crap, getting rid of net zero policy, getting rid of this, that, and the other. And, particularly if one of the advisors who's saying that is Tony Blair. Now, most of you either remember Tony Blair or know who he is, but just to remind ourselves, in 1997, he won a landslide victory, leading the Labour Party back to power for the first time in a long time, 20 years. And a lot of people, I can't really see him or hear him without actually also thinking about Michael Sheen, the Welsh actor, who kind of nailed him so well in a film called The Queen, that, in many people's minds, because we see Michael Sheen a lot more in public than we do Tony Blair these days, that's the voice I have in my head.
Prime Minister.
Good morning, Majesty. Sorry to disturb, but I was just wondering whether you'd seen any of today's papers.
We've managed to look at one or two, yes.
In which case, my next question would be whether you felt some kind of response might be necessary.
No. I believe a few over-eager editors are doing their best to sell newspapers, and it would be a mistake to dance to their tune.
Under normal circumstances, I would agree. But, well, my advisors have been taking the temperature among people on the streets. And, well, the information I'm getting is that the mood is quite delicate.
But later on, as his reputation got a little more mixed, let's say, post-Iraq War, most other things, and also Michael Sheen's career going on, I now in my brain, whenever I hear the actual Tony Blair or see the actual Tony Blair in the newspaper, what comes into my brain is something else entirely, a different character played by Michael Sheen.
Ah, young Bella. Immortality becomes you.
That would be the king of the vampires in Twilight. And like an undead malign force with a weird laugh, Tony Blair rose from the grave just hours before polls opened this week, and gave some advice that net zero was doomed. And this wasn't like an off the cuff, hot mic, someone leaked, this meeting, la la la. No. This was a forward of a report by the Tony Blair Institute, and there was a deliberate media campaign to make sure that line was splashed across the front pages of the Telegraph, the Times, Daily Mail, the Express, every paper that would take it here in the UK, knowing it would have a deliberate, calculated effect on the debate that would be happening after the election. An attempt to position someone as saying, like, well, I told you, this is why we got to do it my way. And what's my way? My way is, by the way, just keep burning stuff, use carbon capture, because no one's ever tried that and it's worked out super well. And nuclear, which again, no one has ever tried before and is super popular. So that's one way to go. The question is, like, who are you going to listen to then? Right? In the show notes and the newsletter, we're going to link to lots of polling data that suggests, as per what Holly said at the beginning, climate is not unpopular. In places like Clacton, again, another pretty much at-risk area, it is like has 68% support for climate action from voters there. And that constituency returned Nigel Farage in Essex. So things are kind of complicated in the sense that this is being given salience by Reform. Their own voters aren't particularly paying attention to it as an issue. In fact, if they were to pay attention to it, they might realize that a party they're supporting, in fact, is working against what they think needs to happen. And that now we're going to find out what's going to happen with this government, one of the most progressive left on the planet in terms of trying to implement climate action and energy, measures to make energy cleaner and more secure. Whether that's going to continue or whether there's going to be a shift. And Morgan McSweeney, who would be his chief advisor of Keir Starmer, he has said he will be going away and look at all the numbers and come back and da-da-da-da, as you'd expect. So last night, when the Times paper record here carried a piece by Keir Starmer, that was significant in terms of instant reaction of like, yes, I listened, I heard you, we're taking it very seriously, as you'd expect, but not actually just leaving it at that, actually saying that we're going to double down on some of these policy areas that we promised. We're going to double down on doing something about the NHS. We're going to double down about, job security. We're going to double down on some of these other things. So one of those policies, and the Times linked to the mention of it, thinking that's what it meant, to a piece by its science editor Tom Whipple, showing this kind of solar punky future in 2050 where everything kind of worked out against Tony Blair's advice. And so Starmer says the following: so we will improve wages and people's security at work and create the conditions for new industries and jobs to flourish. He goes on, we will make the right investments to bring down energy bills once and for all. And that's the part the Times linked to the Tom Whipple piece and talking about. We will deliver for you. So that's it. New industries, low energy bills, hopefully code, as opposed to there's another line about drivers. There's another line about immigration, which didn't make me super happy, but that's just me. And because, look, the polling data is really clear. And we're going to put lots of links in the show notes and the newsletter to some of that data. This stuff is overwhelmingly popular with voters once you explain it to them. And it obviously would be a shame, to say the least, if a government with a huge majority here were to double back and go against what they campaigned on. But that's not even necessarily the most likely scenario. In fact, more kind of tweaked, careful messaging and kind of avoiding some of the topics, just ignores is probably necessary but not sufficient. It ignores the fact that there has been a well-orchestrated, well-financed, from global dark money campaign trying to demonize this stuff for years. And now these people are going to get a bigger microphone. And unless, in fact, there is an attempt to make sure that the reasons that voters came to these conclusions in the first place, they are reminded of those reasons. And the stakes are not just about slightly marginally different electricity rates and Yeah, that is important. Absolutely. What's also more important is that here in the UK, where we started the Industrial Revolution that has moved humanity out of the Goldilocks zone of a habitable climate, we're now doing that globally. And we have to do something both to cope with the effects that we've already baked in and to do something to make sure we stop doing the damage. And so if any version of Joseph Gelfer's climate populism or Rupert Reed's climate majority were to emerge, it will only come about if enough voters understand that stakes are a lot higher than just some poshos who might just get a few more shekels getting their, extra house or, because they want to get their extra TV contract or book contract. They're willing to say stuff that actually is going to make the problem worse. These people deserve to be as popular as cancer. Not figures that should be feted and placated and given a nice little pat on the head and told how, they represent the underclass, the working man, the forgotten people. That's just bollocks. And the people saying it and doing it know it's bollocks. So this election is kind of a last warning, it feels like. It's either double down and actually get this messaging right, get the arguments right, and make sure that people understand that the people who are arguing against things like net zero are the people who, for their own small reasons, see some short-term benefit for themselves in doing so and ignoring the longer-term consequences. So you got to stop hoping for the best. Get some garlic. Get some holy water. Get a crucifix. And sharpen some stakes. Because they're not going to go through the climate vampire heart on their own. Deep breath. Okay. So we have our two interviews coming up in a moment, starting with Holly Brazier-Tope from Green Alliance and climate journalist Dave Vedder. Followed in part 2 with our chat with Adam Bell from Stonehaven. First couple of quick requests. We're in this fight because there's no other choice. People who see the problem and want to put their financial, technology, business, research, policy, and creative chops to work on it, we kind of need to stick together. And that means supporting other outlets, independent journalism, supporting outlets like wickedproblems.earth. And if you can help spread the word, that'd be amazing. It really does matter. And if you like what we're doing, again, please say so. Give us a rating and review, help people know about the show. And that's it. That's the begging bowl for today. Right back with Holly and Dave. So, polls open for the UK local elections. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, or as we were discussing in the green room, as per Twilight, and has the actor who plays him and other things there, Tony Blair, as a possible vampire, just saying, came out claiming that net zero strategies are doomed to fail. He's thrown a grenade to the national climate conversation here in the UK. Delighted we could be joined by Holly Brazier-Tope, Deputy Director of Politics at Green Alliance, the independent think tank Green Alliance here in the UK, and senior contributor, returning champion to Wicked Problems, Forbes contributor, climate journalist, and bon vivant, and classic shit poster on Blue Sky, Dave Vedder. Thank you both for joining the show.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
I can tell. We're all very pleased to be here. That's great. So, Dave, I'm going to start with you because I want to be unfair, and I know you've had a long morning already, a long day, so we're definitely going to put this on you. But you've covered stuff for years, right? So, Tony Blair came out yesterday, and I'm going to hold this up amongst other headlines. It's weird. There's a whole media strategy, despite the fact that, yesterday, oh, we didn't really mean all that. Oh, weirdly, you had the front page of the Telegraph, the Times, big things in the Guardian, other places, and yet, oh, we didn't know whether it was going to cause such a big fuss. So what struck you most about Tony Blair deciding to reverse ferret on reducing fossil fuels and declaring that net zero was doomed to fail?
Okay. I mean, there's a lot going on here. They shoehorned an awful lot into this report, this paper, but it really puts, you can only view it from the perspective of a Tony Blair product. And it puts me in the mind of the ancient idiom, if all you have is a Tony Blair, every problem looks like it can be solved with a private finance initiative. The bit that really burned my beans was on this paper. It was possibly deliberately, don't know, but it misdiagnoses why net zero policies are becoming less popular. And we've got some polling that suggests net zero policies are becoming less popular. And it's not really surprising that would be the case. But at one point, if you read this report, I think the executive summary, in fact, states that the debate needs to be taken out of the hands of campaigners and put in the hands of policymakers, which by itself is a ludicrous thing to write, because putting climate action into the hands of policymakers is precisely what campaigners are trying to achieve, as if activists have been preventing government from doing sort of radical steps to cut emissions. What on earth are you talking about? So it struck me as a message from the upside down, that particular aspect of it. But there's a lot of aspects you can get into.
Well, and let's get into some of those. I mean, so basically, I think one of the things that was notable, and I'll come to Holly in a moment, but basically, this move to talk about I wrote this, David, I unfortunately, I inflicted this on you and sent it to you, this insanely, stupidly long piece about Elon Musk, right? And his fascination with different forms of sci-fi.
It's
some quotes from his Tesla all hands a few weeks ago, where he's predicting in the same way that that paper from 2023, or Jenny Chase on a day where she might be taking some drugs or whatever, is we'll all be solar and battery 90% within a few years, blah blah blah, right? That's all good, but no, because Tony Blair's no, we need carbon capture, we need nuclear, we need realism, and I just don't get where this is. That is that supposed to be techno optimism? I don't really get it. So what was your take on that? Just seemed to me like a completely random, weird, left field, where did this come from thing.
No, I mean, this isn't random. There's a lot of people out there that say this type of thing. And there's a huge number of people who've been banging the drum for CDR and CCS, and most notably the fossil fuel industries. And we know Blair has developed a pretty good relationship with Saudis and so on over the years, and that type of threat isn't going to really concern him as much. And indeed, I should say, that's something that the report seems to conveniently ignore. The fact that the fantastically pernicious influence of the fossil fuel industry sort of is everywhere, and the fact that the British media owners are in bed with oil, gas, and coal. The owner of GB News is a hedge fund with more than $2 billion in fossil fuel investments. The Tories have taken more than $8 billion in fossil fuel donations since 2019. there's a reason net zero policies are becoming less popular, and that has nothing to do with activists or materiality or the effectiveness of net zero policies, and it's all to do with effective propaganda. So I think that's what really undergirds this, is that you've got to look at where are these messages coming from, and that's not I'm not claiming here that TBI is just another arm of the fossil fuel industry, but I think that if you look at the work of people like Genevieve Gunther, who's recently released a book on this exact thing, The Language of Climate Politics, they're falling into the same traps that she describes. She talks about how the fossil fuel industry has influenced the language we use to talk about climate, especially in policy terms.
And let's go back to that, because we've again a long delayed interview with Genevieve that I recorded a few weeks ago, but then basically everything seemed to go sideways, and so I had to decide oh God, we have to decide whether to put this out. So Holly, sorry I want to keep you waiting. I want to come to you. So essentially, as Dave was saying, some people have argued, this move by the Tony Blair Institute and Tony Blair in particular, is a result, is kind of a reaction to this idea, however motivated, that the net zero the case for net zero, right, whether it's from policy or politics, that's come under siege, it's under threat, it's collapsing. That seems to be the vibe going into when this came out and the initial headlines, right? So what was your take on the idea? Is it in fact collapsing?
Interesting question. Well, just to draw on some of the things you were just talking about, I think what's difficult is that actually in the report, if you read it, there are some things that really make sense and that we need to think about as a movement, right? And one of those things is acknowledging that the politics of it is incredibly hard. But what interventions like this do is make the politics a hell of a lot harder. And I think whatever the motivations were, be it utter stupidity or political naivety to think that it wouldn't be what it has turned out to be this week and hitting literally every single major headline in the last 2 days is just a phenomenal feat. I think that there is a very real problem in this country, that the cross-party consensus on climate is fracturing. That is in large part because of reform and the way that they have approached it. Nigel Farage is very openly talking about the fact that net zero is the new Brexit thing. It's the thing that he can get the public, to support reform on. And he's very open about that. But what they are all very carefully trying to do, them being Farage, but also Kemi Badenoch, are talking about it in a way that climate is a given. They believe in climate change. What they don't believe in is the transition to net zero. And it's such an interesting framing, the whole way that they have managed to kind of harness the debate on it. And I think, that Tony Blair, basically, he is right. The cross-party consensus is sort of crumbling. And that is also, coming through to people in Number 10 now that don't actually want to have this fight. They don't particularly believe in climate for an ideological, they're not particularly supportive. And they are trying to push the government itself into positions that, they don't want to fight Farage on this. They want to fight him on something else. They think they can win on immigration, whatever it is. But from a policy lens, they absolutely cannot disagree with the fact that climate science and the imperative for, developed countries to act, it's never been clearer. And I think the debate is over how you get there, not the fact that you have to, and yet they're still constantly framing the two as separate arguments.
So since 2019, right here in the UK, right, legislation was passed that basically enshrined some net zero targets for 2050 into law. Chris Skidmore, junior minister at the time, oversaw that and signed off on, the bill as it became law. Talking to people around him over the last couple of years, I've asked people, do you think it was great? It was passed without any objection or opposition or debate at the time in 2019, because is that not something that saved up some trouble, and is not what's happening now, people exploiting the fact that we didn't really have a thoroughgoing debate about how to do this stuff in 2019? So Holly, back to you. Again, as a both political and policy matter, it's something that it almost feels to me like the fact that we didn't have the Barney, we didn't have the argument in a more thoroughgoing way, has created space for people to come back and say, well, was not a legitimate decision because we didn't really debate it.
Nice small question. Great. It encompasses so many different things, doesn't it? I think that part of the problem of that people see is that coming back to that question now means that the answer should be that we should have some kind of referendum on net zero. And that is like utter insanity. We cannot get to a place where that is what...
Well, the last referendum worked out so well.
Exactly,
so, yeah,
famously. So, and I just think probably it's simply too big a thing to be able to, you know, you're not going to put one vision for, okay, we could do net zero like this, or we could do it like this, and put that to the people. That's not how it works, right? But one thing that has become abundantly clear, particularly in recent years, as it's kind of become the centre of like the culture wars, if you like, is that people absolutely have to be put at the heart. And that is something that policymakers have not done well. And it's something politicians have not done well. And that's why people are feeling angry. And, you know, we were talking about a little bit about polling and where it lands with people. Yes, fine, it might be reducing in salience slightly, but it does still poll in the top 5 issues, like really consistently. And it is really consistently seen in, you know, there's a Persuasion findings out this week talking about where the threat actually lies on net zero. And to government, it really is not from people that are not that are really worried about net zero. They want to scrap net zero. That's just like sort of, it's been taken up by Farage as people that will always vote reform agree that net zero is a problem, right? Other people that are like reform curious from various different parties that don't necessarily have like a political home, net zero is not the thing that's driving them. Net zero is not something they're particularly interested in. The threat to the government is so much more likely to be from people on further to the left of them that they are hemorrhaging votes from, and they don't think that is important. They don't seem to care. So I don't think it is the premise of net zero itself and like people, but what needs to happen is like a much more adult conversation about exactly how you do it, and that's talking about, you know, local solutions and talking about what power mayors and councils and stuff have. But it goes into so many bigger issues than just that, and I think it's being used as a really, really unhelpful kind of narrative to talk about the politics of climate more broadly.
So, Holly, before I move on to the next question, you made me think of something there. It was like tomorrow is obviously the local elections, right? And so
today,
I think it's today. It's today, May 1st. There we go. Great. There you go. I'm not a voter here, so there you go. That's why my excuse. But you know, like tomorrow we're going to be, you know, poring over exit polls and interpretations, your Luke Akehursts of the world and whoever else, right, who are going to basically be pouring over it. If what you're saying, it sounds like it's going to be more important than ever, certainly for folks who are in government, to correctly interpret whatever the results are, because obviously the narrative that's already been set is that if reform wins, you know, a bunch of seats, well, that validates this idea that net zero is a problem. And if your thesis is correct, and in fact, you know, like because of the way the electoral system works, you know, if reform picks up seats because Labour voters defected to Greens or defected to some other party, you know, where that actually might then create space for a reform candidate to win, you know, that threatens to be washed away in the analysis, you know, starting whatever, you know, 4:00 tomorrow morning. So what's your take? What are you looking for? What would your advice be to people who are in government, but how to, like, you know, interpret the results that are going to be happening in such a way that they take on board the potential for what your analysis says might be correct?
I think it's honestly, the top line is to not think too much into tomorrow, because I think this is such a select set of elections, right? This is not the entire country going to the polls. This is a very small selection of individual councils. There are individual circumstances in every single one of them. Yes, there will be this switch to reform, but because of the, you know, actually inherently, our media system more broadly, should I put it politely, will give airtime to reform no matter what happens. If they win 300 seats, that will be seen as like this huge crushing thing. If they win 600 seats, that will also be true. The narrative has already been set, and I think what has happened in the last few weeks particularly is that people want to read, particularly on climate, into the fact that it is reform that, you know, are winning against all odds. You know, they're still like coming from behind, and actually what's happening is the fact that in 2021 the Conservatives were at an all-time high, particularly in terms of local elections. It was a Boris Johnson like mega sweep of the country, they are inevitably going to lose those seats. People are feeling disengaged, disenchanted with politics. They don't trust politicians. Reform isn't a protest vote to that. The issue is not climate. The issue is that people feel that they want action, and there's a cost of living crisis that is not going away, and people feel like they voted for a new government that was going to represent real change, and that change hasn't come. And this is a way of really showing that. And people all my plea eternally all of this week has been to Number 10 to not read too much into this and think that this means that the entire country support everything reform stand for. Not everyone wants to deport all migrants and scrap all net zero targets. That's just not true. So you cannot read too much into results like this.
So, I mean, again, both of you have been very patient, and I appreciate we're coming up against the time that I kind of asked you both for because of some technical issues on my end at the beginning. So thank you for your patience. If you get time for a couple more questions, each of you, then I just want to put a couple to you. Dave first. So, based on what Holly just said, I mean, do we think that, based on... So there's been this furious backlash, right, particularly within Labour, against whether it's either what Tony Blair said or how what he said has been interpreted or whatever you want to say about that. But the fact that there was this muscle memory to push back and say no, I'm sorry. No, net zero is something we're sticking with. Thanks very much, lads. Thanks, Tony. But, and even to the point where, Keir Starmer yesterday at PMQs said, no, Tony Blair's totally aligned with this agenda, and whether that's true or not, that Tony Blair didn't come out to dispute that, right? So clearly there was a whole thing. Does that suggest that there is actually more resilience than maybe either Blair or whoever else, kind of cheerleading a vibe shift? Do they underestimate the resilience of the kind of formerly pretty stable climate consensus? Is it not as dead as they think?
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily resilient. I think that anyone who knows what they're talking about is on pretty much the same page as they've always been. I think that, as we've spoken about here, yes, there is this threat of reform. And I think that what has happened, unfortunately, in recent years is that we've seen this, the center of the climate debate has now become firmly, it's stuck firmly with the immediate economic aspects of net zero and why this is good for the economy, and none of the other co-benefits and crucial aspects that come along with achieving net zero. So I think the problem here, and I think a lot of people sense this, is that this government in particular feels very vulnerable to the far right and has a tendency to try and outmaneuver the far right to the right, which is frightening, to say the least. It speaks to the sort of shocked political instincts of certain people in government. But I think that what we haven't mentioned here is that another very public thing that Reform has been doing is running around and asking the oil and gas industry for cash handouts. They are quite publicly asking fossil fuel industries for money so that they can be the party of fossil fuel. So it's not, I mean, that's right out there. So that can't be ignored. So I think that because the center has now moved to the economic aspects, that in many ways that does leave them vulnerable. That leaves the quote unquote center vulnerable to be dragged right.
I mean, so last couple of questions then. I mean, so Holly, I think that, this news cycle has just been insane for the last, 24, 36 hours, whatever it is. What do you think? I mean, you guys have actually, your organization, Grid Alliance, we spoke to your colleague Lydia not too long ago, and we'll put that episode out. In speaking about, you guys have put some monetary analysis on the impact on households in terms of the effects of climate change. I know that Lydia was very keen to make sure that, that gets in the right ears. But Blair suggests that, the reason that costs, that public support, again, and the polling, I'm not sure actually suggests this, contra Dave, like has been waning, is due to costs, right? But the costs, that will be experienced for households, for the Treasury, for everybody, are staggering, galactic, compared to the investments that might be required to achieve some of these goals. I mean, so, where do you guys come down on like whether or not, how that debate's going to play out over the next year or so in terms of like that cost thing? Who's going to win the argument? But like, well, it's really about this or not this or this in terms of cost.
I think it's really complicated. And to be honest, the main thing that ordinary public in thinking about cost of this, the way that they engage with it and the way they think about it is on their energy bills, right? That's the one thing that every month they're like, right, well, it's suddenly really expensive. What's going on? Why hasn't it gone down? Like nothing's, Russia and Ukraine, there's nothing new happening particularly. Like, so why is my bill still so high? And I think the problem that we have is that the government actually still don't have an answer to that. They don't have a clear and comprehensive plan for how they will get energy bills down during this parliament. That is in part, due to things not in their control. I completely concede that. There are global factors and we are in a global energy market that, if we just get some more oil and gas out of the North Sea, people's bills still won't go down. That is not going to help. But they have to accept that is the one way ordinary people understand the cost of like climate and energy and stuff more broadly. And unless we can come up with like a sensible plan that is not just like scrapping levies or whatever it is in like an economically incredibly constrained time, you're not going to leverage any of the business investment that you need in order to make half of these like renewables targets alongside lots of other things. But what we need is for tangible solutions that offer, the government do have good rhetoric on. This is pretty much the only growth agenda that they actually have that's serious. And I think that's one of the reasons they can't actively scrap it in the coming like months, at least short to medium term, maybe not necessarily in the longer term, because they don't have any other plans in what is a fairly dire economic situation. This is it. They have put all their eggs in this basket and therefore they have to follow through. You can't do that half-heartedly if this is the plan. But what they have, as I say, what they haven't done is like the active like narrative around bills and making sure that vulnerable households and stuff are supported through that, because they did get support at the beginning. There were help with bills over winter when people have really high heating bills, and that is not showing, and people are upset, and inevitably then the mood music around net zero cuts through, because they're like, well, if that's the reason my bills are high, then yeah, fine, I don't want that anymore. So like you have to be alive to that, you have to understand that, and we have to come up with other solutions.
Well, look, I want to come back to a couple of quick fire questions then for here at the very end, if you still have a couple more minutes. One is like, so first to you, Dave, and I'm going to ask you both of this question. Does this intervention by, I'm going to say it again, Tony Blair, represent like some other like symptom of this vibe shift? We've heard people talk about, so the Council on Foreign Relations put out their new program about climate realism, and never mind the Trump administration, but like Tony Blair's that Gates has stepped back from funding climate tech, huge ramifications for breakthrough in some of the lobbying they were doing in Europe and the UK. It's a huge deal, like what seems to be underway. And so like, what should we interpret? What should we think that means in terms of how? Because I think this took a lot of people by surprise. That's why so many people in Labour were so angry about this, right? So like this seemed to be like, oh mate, you too? Really? Oh come on. So I mean, like, how is it? He just late to the party and like reading signals that are actually maybe already old, or is he just the harbinger of worse things to come?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think that I think this may have been in the works for a while. I think I would be very surprised if they'd timed it to do this. I can't quite see the through point there. Why would you deliberately undermine? Because heaven knows the Starmer...
Well, they knew when the elections were, right?
Yeah, sure, but does the right hand know what the left?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Okay, fine. But there cannot be a more pro Tony Blair guy than Keir Starmer, other than Tony Blair, as far as I can tell. So I mean, what are they doing that, and quite apart from anything else, this government has been quite pro a lot of what Tony Blair's talking about in the report, much to the consternation of many climate people and people who know what they're talking about. So, I think going back to the timing, I don't know. Is it a harbinger of things to come? I mean, I think so. I mean, you just have to look at the US and what's happening there to see that we're in for a very, very tough fight on every front. But I would prefer not to read too much into what a former prime minister is attempting to do or not do. Yeah,
former prime minister who also his organization happens to be taking in millions and millions of dollars from some folks who perhaps have an interest in some of the things that he's talking about. But we can.
Yes.
I'm not going to put you on record, Dave, about that because you have some people you have to satisfy and we don't want to get into trouble. But Holly, same question to you. How significant? Who's in a racing car?
I know. I'm really sorry. It's outside my house.
Is that your house?
I think so.
That's right.
Hold on.
Vroom, vroom, vroom. I love it.
Heavens above.
I tell you.
It's that sun gets people. Everyone's.
I tell you, yeah, people get crazy. People get crazy. We will
Be crazy. Yeah. It's that silly
But
season.
Holly, over to you. Same question. I mean, so how seriously should we take this as a harbinger of things to come, as opposed to like maybe this is the last gasp of a populist wave, which I saw some analysis of. Like might be some hopium yesterday saying like, hey, like the populist wave is crested, it's over, and we're just seeing the last bits of people who are like super late to the party getting in at the moment where you should not be, buying at the moment you should be selling, in terms of the trend. And maybe for whatever reason, Tony Blair's lost all of his political instincts and decided to go all in at exactly the moment you should not be doing that. What should I think about that? Those possibilities?
No, I'm afraid I think this is just the beginning. I say that as, it doesn't even feel like the beginning. I feel like we've been fighting this fight for a long time, but I think we're probably back to the basics of, having to justify action on climate, whereas we got so far beyond that. We got to like the how and the what rather than the why, and it feels like we've really gone backwards. But I would say my one thing of hope from this week, to be honest, is that there are many forces within Labour that don't want net zero to be as prominent as it is. And actually what has happened in the last week is that Keir Starmer, having last week said that the clean energy mission and the transition to renewables is like part of the DNA of this government, he has then come out again this week and his team have forced Tony Blair to make a public apology. Yes, his words have still been unbelievably damaging, but they did make that happen. And two, it has forced Number 10 to recommit to this agenda at a time when Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, is under constant pressure and does not have that many allies in government. So that is fundamentally a good thing for our agenda. Be that in the short or medium term, questionable in the long. But I think in the broader narrative, it's a really good thing that we've got a government that is committed. What we need to do is make sure that other parties, don't walk down the reform road and think that is, the one thing that they need to be worried about. The Conservatives have a proud record on things to do with nature, for example. We need them to own that rather than run away from it. So I think that's my one moment of hope from the week.
Well, Holly Brazier-Tope, Deputy Director of Politics at Green Alliance, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And Dave Vedder, Senior Contributor at Forbes, climate journalist, bon vivant, and again, shitposter extraordinaire on Blue Sky. So thank you both for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we look forward to hopefully having you both back again soon.
Yes, please.
Anytime.
Many thanks to Holly Brazier-Tope from Grid Alliance, who I might have misnamed as the Director of Politics. She's a Deputy Director, so apologies for that. And Dave Vedder, climate journalist, writing most recently in Forbes, but also, I believe, breaking news here, also now contributor for Fortune. So, good luck with that, and congratulations to both, because I know that for Holly it was also a recent promotion. Now here's my interview with Adam Bell, in just a moment, from Stonehaven, UK, the consultancy, where we'll talk more about the vibe shift and what does it mean in a broader sense. Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, UK. Thanks for coming back on the show, man. What a week.
Indeed, always a pleasure to be back, but indeed, what a week.
So we're talking on Friday morning, the 2nd of May. The results are still being counted in lots of parts of the country from the local elections overnight, but a couple of results were pretty clear coming in. We have a climate-denying member of the board of Net Zero Watch, Mayor of Lincolnshire, Andrea Jenkins. 14 of 17 seats that were called in the city on this county council went to reform. So it's been quite a week. But let's take a step back, because the week started with big blackout in Spain, and how that played across British headlines was it was just all this dodgy net zero stuff. I mean, were you surprised at some of the coverage here, or were you just sad?
I think if there's anything to do with energy, anything at all that happens, then there will be a part of the media that says, oh, this is net zero. This change is net zero. We never had blackouts before, except all the times that we had blackouts, so it's definitely net zero. It is tiring, but not unexpected.
And I suppose, and then, the next day, I suppose what I wasn't expecting, I don't know if you were expecting it, or if you had a heads up about it, but the next day's headlines, Tony Blair coming in, reading his, the forward of his report for Tony Blair Institute, basically saying, well, guys, net zero is doomed. We should stop fussing about with that stuff. We should do carbon capture, carbon removals, and nuclear. That's working out so well. And forget all this green crap. Did anyone see that coming? Is like the joke of like everyone silence, and then Tony Blair decides to pop up and say whatever that is. But help it make sense.
So the TBI has been on the crusade for greater innovation for some time. That's a reasonably respectable position. You can understand that. What they haven't spoken about is kind of the politics of net zero, and this intervention is clearly around that, and clearly Mr. Blair doing his best to indicate where he thinks the politics are and where they need to go. However, on reading the paper itself, it's kind of weird. Firstly, I mean, Blair the other day kind of almost walked back any kind of impression that we were on the course for cancelling net zero, but the paper itself doesn't seem to argue for that. It seems to argue instead for a bunch of different measures that don't necessarily add up. Essentially, its primary position is the bulk of the carbon we take out of the atmosphere is going to be in developing nations. It's true. And then it goes through a series of bizarre non-sequiturs around that, essentially saying we need to invest more in CCS because we have a lot of fossil infrastructure. And we need to invest more in direct air capture in particular in order to make sure that we can get as much emissions out of the air as possible. Then it goes on to say, and because we're investing in direct air capture, we stand as a warning to developing countries that they should be investing in renewables to avoid the cost of direct air capture. What? At that point, it kind of lost me, I will admit. I mean,
it does seem like a hodgepodge of, like, again, random techno. I mean, again, I'm as techno optimist as you're going to find of somebody who is like not actually in VC land or working in one of these startups or whatever. So like I'm right there, like in spirit. But yeah, like that, it doesn't just make coherent kind of logic to put all these things together. So I mean, like people have pointed to the funding for the TBI, and I'm not going to ask anyone to speculate about like how one makes the other might affect the other, but it is, I agree with you, it's just absolutely bizarre. And you mentioned there was a lot of fallout, right? I mean, it was within hours, minutes, really. Because again, this was not like a random thing. This led in the Telegraph, it led in the Times, it led in the Daily Mail, it led in the Express. So like somebody decided as a media strategy that they were going to give this in advance to all these guys, knowing exactly how it was going to play. And then, within an hour before PMQs, Blair's number 10's got to put out a statement saying, oh, no, there's no daylight between us and Tony Blair on our policies. Is that going to be sustainable, do you think? I mean, or was this is Tony Blair's intervention here obviously timed to try to influence what they're going to have to do now, post the local elections?
I assume he's hoping to shape the direction of travel on Labour. At the same time, though, it's such a clumsy intervention and so overtly unhelpful that he's almost ironically made himself quite unpopular within Labour as well. If it had been any other time other than the elections, then I think you could have they would have prompted a more decent debate. But as it is, a lot of Labour activists are going to be going, why are you having a go at this now, Tony? right now when we're fighting some incredibly hard elections up against Reform, who are overtly opposed to net zero. Where do you think this is going?
Yeah, and I guess that is the question: is where is it going to go? Again, so I mentioned at the top, one of the biggest pylon projects, like high voltage lines to connect offshore wind to the rest of the grid, rest of the country, is a 140-kilometer route across Lincolnshire. Like that seems to have been if not the top campaign issue. This morning I heard Andrew Jenkins someone talking about. Tents should be good enough for refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants, as opposed to hotels. So that's exciting. Net zero didn't get a lot of play in the coverage I heard this morning in terms of radio, but certainly on the doorsteps and certainly in all the print coverage leading up to these elections, like was pretty prominent, and does seem to be an issue on which they get a certain amount of traction. So I guess the question is, where's your gut, or what are you looking for to see early signs about whether or not there's a wobbly need moment from a policy perspective to try to change tack, to try to placate, the vote that they think that they're saying now?
I mean, if you look at where the electorate actually are, we do a lot of polling on this. Even Reform voters are still broadly pro net zero. It's worth noting as well that, in the local elections you saw essentially a 4 to 5 party split, and about 3/4 of the vote, at least closer to 80%, to 4 parties that are explicitly pro net zero. I don't even know, quite frankly, what the Tories are anymore, so I'll count them as vaguely pro net zero because Kemi hasn't really made up her mind. And for voters on the doorstep as well, I think from some of my friends who are in the Labour Party, what they were hearing back was mostly about winter fuel payment and PIP. So Labour's cuts to benefits, Labour's sensible attacks on the vulnerable, much less so than net zero. A pivot at this point, away from something which is broadly supported by the overwhelming majority of people, doesn't seem like a sensible strategy. It seems if Labour do go for this, then they're essentially ignoring their own numbers in favour of a media narrative, which doesn't feel sensible at all.
No, and I think that's, I guess for me, what I'll be interested to see is, I know that a couple of days ago, there was a story that ran with the Institute of Engineers something. Hold on. Now I've lost the plot a little bit here. So not for the first time this week, I must say. Let me just pull that up. There we go. Institution of Engineering and Technology. There we go. Report out a couple of days ago, finding that underground cables were on average about 4.5 times more expensive than overhead lines. And, in some cases, so for a £40 million investment for a build of a 15-kilometer long overhead line, undergrounding that would cost potentially 330 million, or in a new tunnel, 820 million. So if you're going to build this stuff, right, like it's like the maths aren't hard here. In a moment where you're trying to do it relatively quickly, and you're trying to do it in such a way that you don't break the bank, and you do realize that you do need to do something to strengthen the country's grid, no matter what. The idea that it looks like anyway that so far, they've been trying to signal that they're not going to change course. Like last week at the IEA, the Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband kind of being positioned as standing up to the Yanks. About tell us net zero stuff. Like, no, that's our way forward. I guess what would make you worried that you would, where would you start looking for, as a guy with all your experience of looking at Whitehall and Westminster, where would you be looking for slippage as an early indicator that would start to give you cause for concern?
So I'm less worried almost about the headline power measures, because they've been almost a test of strength, and I'm much more worried about the harder measures that are already tricky, especially around heat decarbonisation. That's regardless of what one thinks of heat pumps. I've got one myself, and my home is warm, admittedly today because it's very hot, but even still. They're expensive, they're a cost, and they're a cost that most people don't want to pay. That is where the most politically vulnerable bit of net zero right now, and that is where, if there's going to be backsliding, I would expect it to start.
Right. And you got the air source one. This way you can actually flip it to AC as opposed to just the heat. But just anyway, I'm sure you thought about that. But it is interesting. That is an interesting policy area. And again, it's going to come down to I think we talked a few months ago now about the idea that the person with the housing portfolio was going to be as much impact on helping set standards and about whether or not heat pumps were going to get A, relief, and B, be part of any kind of standards for home building going forward. But it's just wow. I mean, the timing of all this is just wow. So anything else? I mean, I suppose I've heard some worrying things in that, I don't know why the minister would come out and say, like, yeah, we're definitely going to make sure that every single part of the value chain of any solar things that we install is definitely going to not have anything that we might come to regret later, which seems like with reference to Chinese-made solar PV modules. That just feels like giving a hostage to fortune that maybe you didn't need to do.
I mean, if they think they can have a credible evaluation of the supply chain for all the components that they mandate installation, best of luck with them. It's incredibly hard to do as it is. Essentially, you would need to avoid buying solar from China almost entirely and avoid buying it from third countries that are re-exporting Chinese products. It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. I fully understand the need to avoid buying solar panels made in Xinjiang by essentially slave labor. That makes sense to me. A way of doing it, I've yet to see.
Well, indeed, and I'm not here to excuse the Chinese Communist Party by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, it's always interesting the selectivity about which supply chains we decide to look at and which we don't. We're not super interested all the time, and I love this word, artisanal cobalt miners in DRC, 10-year-old kids digging around in the dirt, for bits of cobalt. And yet every cell phone in the world, every mobile phone in the world has it in there. But anyway, consistency has never really been a requirement for either in media or in politics. So I guess in terms of the wider scene, though, right? Like, not just here in the UK, or even leaving America aside necessarily, but like we see Bill Gates pull back, right, in terms of funding, certainly advocacy. And his different efforts both had a huge impact on European legislation and on the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act in America. So he's stepped off the stage. We've other people who've pulled back dramatically, and at the same time we have others, ramping up. The Heartland Institute with its new UK operation, very exciting. We've got a climate-denying mayor of Lincolnshire. So that people talked about the vibe shift, and it was a great semaphore piece. I don't know if you saw it with how these WhatsApp and Signal groups, have been slowly red-pilling, otherwise centrist commentators over the last few years to help engineer said vibe shift. Are we in a global recession when it comes to actually people not just talking about climate action or doing anything with climate action, but even being willing to stand up and say the stuff that we've already done is actually on the right track? Because it kind of feels like we're slipping away from that.
So that is very much a story in the States right now. I think the climate movement has its greatest ally right now in Donald Trump, because you can point to his tariffs as a direct cause of global recession, because they will be. They're already causing growth in America to dramatically slow down. I mean, we were all expecting their Q2 GDP results to be awful. This does give the climate movement a little bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you can say, well, quite frankly, the reason why the globe is slowing down is because of essentially insane populists doing things that have got no basis in fact, that's quite helpful. It's quite helpful for ultimately arguments against reform over here as well, given that they are so closely associated with Trump. I mean, the UK's election dynamics are peculiar. Most people would regard the local elections essentially as an opportunity to protest, as they have historically done. The real test is going to be at the next election, and how serious they are about reform now that they've heard more about them.
Well, I suppose how they perform, how they do, right? Andrew Jenkins is threatening to have a mini Doge, and I saw Nigel Farage saying the same thing. Every local council in the country should have a mini Doge, and maybe bring in Elon Musk to run each of them, because he seems pretty free and not doing a lot of other things at the moment. But so that is interesting. Anything else that you're kind of keeping your eye on at the moment? I mean, again, like, it's just been a really kind of whirly-gig week. I mean, my head's a little bit spinning, but anything else you're keeping your eye on?
So The most interesting thing for me this week has absolutely been the fallout from the Spanish Grid event and figuring out exactly what's happened, because we still don't know. The actual kind of event itself that prompted, well, the two events that prompted the lovingly titled Frequency Cascade are still unknown. It looks like something fell off, but we still don't know what. How this relates to how we build our gates and features is going to be really interesting, because what we do know is that you can make low carbon grids just as stable as high carbon grids using different technologies that achieve the same sort of result. What we don't necessarily have yet is a complete sense as to whether we've made sure that this is all going to happen as part of the transition. So that's for electricity, that question is the next kind of detailed question that regulators are going to look at. And as an absolute geek, that is fascinating to me.
I think the investigation I think is going to be really important when it comes out. I mean, obviously there's a little bit of people knee-jerking both way, one way and the other. We had Tom Raftery on the show, episode we put out yesterday, about who lived through this. He lives near Seville. He's a guy from Cork. And he, kind of his take on it was, obviously Iberian Peninsula is kind of an energy island. You've only got the one overland interconnect, into France. So that's kind of tricky for development of a European-wide power market. And then the second bit is that they really underinvested in storage, things that could provide synthetic inertia in order to be able to kind of like help to firm up and provide ancillary services should something trip. But the potentially because I put it to him like, oh well, people are just saying it's net zero and renewables. I'm like, that's bollocks, right? He's like, well, unless you consider it from a design perspective that you haven't built enough into the network, that you're, it's great that you get 90%, solar, in terms of generation on the grid for given days. But if you don't have the batteries to back it up, then that could wind up being a problem. And maybe that's what's happened here. So, I mean, the investigation is going to be hugely contested, I would imagine, in terms of the findings. You've been looking at this obviously more closely than I have. I've seen, the European one could take months. The Spanish government one is, they're going to be under pressure to come up with some answers pretty soon. As a guy who's been in a policy hot seat before, what is your kind of over-under for when you would hear something that you would find credible coming out of these multiple investigations that are happening now?
I assume that the Spanish will have something within 6 weeks, providing they've already got an initial timeline of events. Once they've got approximate calls for the frequency event, plus a sense as to why their automatic protection systems didn't kick in, they'll have essentially a reasonably complete picture. That should be within 6 weeks.
Right. Well, that's something to look forward to, I guess. We can maybe hopefully get you back on to talk about it when we know more. But I mean, it was obvious from the jump, the way it was used in British media, that that's something that people will be using one way or the other to support whatever argument they already were planning to make. But look, Adam Bell, Director of Policy at Stonehaven, thanks for coming on, man, and have a great weekend.
Always a pleasure.
Especially when I always said that I haven't got the words. Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.